original narrative, especially created for Love Behind Gold. Ethan Cole straightened his designer tie as he stepped in the dimly lit Manhattan restaurant, already regretting the blind date his sister had orchestrated. The matter guided him to a secluded corner table where crystal glasses caught the candlelight like tiny diamonds. He checked his watch. 7 minutes early. Perfect for a man who built an empire on precision. When the restaurant door opened again, Ethan's practiced smile froze on his face. Standing in the entrance was Sophie Lane, her dark hair shorter than he remembered, her eyes still the same impossible shade of green that had haunted his dreams for a decade. She approached slowly, each step deliberate, as recognition transformed her expression from curiosity to something harder, more wounded. "Hello, Ethan," she said, sliding into the seat across from him, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I bet when you agreed to this blind date, you weren't expecting the girl whose heart you broke 10 years ago." Ethan Cole had mastered the art of graceful refusal. At 32, as the CEO of Cole Enterprises and one of Manhattan's most eligible bachelors, he'd perfected the polite decline of everything from investment opportunities to romantic entanglements. But when it came to his younger sister Mia, his resolve always crumbled. "It's just dinner, Ethan," Mia had insisted during their weekly phone call. "She's brilliant, compassionate, and definitely not after your money. You need someone real in your life." He'd reluctantly agreed, if only to silence her persistent matchmaking. Now, seated at a corner table in Lumiere, where reservations required both connections and patience, Ethan checked his watch. 7:53 p.m. His date would arrive any minute. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the occasional clink of fine china. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the cream-colored walls, creating an atmosphere of understated luxury. Ethan felt at home in such places. Controlled environments where wealth whispered rather than shouted. He straightened almost imperceptibly when the maître d' approached, guiding a woman through the maze of tables. From a distance, he noted her simple elegance, a navy dress that suggested confidence rather than seeking attention, dark hair falling just above her shoulders, minimal jewelry, professional, poised. Perhaps this wouldn't be a complete waste of an evening after all. Then she stepped into the light, and time collapsed. Sophie Lane. The name he'd buried beneath a decade of ambition and achievement now stood before him, as real as the knot forming in his stomach. Her eyes, those unmistakable eyes, widened slightly when they met his, the only indication that she was equally surprised. "Mr. Cole, your guest has arrived," the maître d' announced unnecessarily. Ethan rose automatically, muscle memory from countless business dinners taking over where conscious thought failed him. "Thank you," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. Sophie settled into the chair opposite him, her movements deliberate and controlled. For 3 excruciating seconds, neither spoke. The waiter appeared with water, an unwitting savior breaking the tension. "I'll have a glass of the Barolo," Sophie said without opening the wine menu. Her voice was lower than he remembered, more assured. "The same," Ethan echoed, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the surreal reality of her presence. When the waiter departed, Sophie looked directly at him. No smile softened her expression. No warmth invited small talk. Instead, she studied him with the careful assessment of someone cataloging changes. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the more defined jaw, the expertly tailored suit that replaced the university hoodies he'd once lived in. "Sophie," he finally said, her name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. "This is unexpected, is it?" Something flickered across her face, not quite anger, not quite amusement. "Your sister Mia works with my colleague Hannah. Small world, apparently. She didn't mention your name. Would you have come if she had?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. The Sophie he'd known at 20 had been thoughtful but hesitant, brilliant but unsure of her place. This woman before him wielded her words with precision. "I don't know," he answered honestly. Sophie nodded, accepting his response without judgment. She took a sip of water, her composure unnerving him more than any accusation might have. "You don't seem surprised to see me," Ethan observed. "I'm not." She set down her glass carefully. I recognized your name when Hannah suggested this setup. I could have declined. Why didn't you? The wine arrived, temporarily halting their conversation. The waiter poured with practiced flourish, oblivious to the current beneath their exchange. When he departed, Sophie lifted her glass but didn't drink. You broke my heart 10 years ago, Ethan. The words hung between them, simple and devastating. No dramatic accusation, no raised voice. Just a quiet statement of fact that hit harder than any recrimination could have. I spent years wondering what I'd say if I ever saw you again, she continued, rehearsing speeches, imagining scenarios. Then Hannah mentioned setting me up with Mia's brother, and I realized I needed to face you. Not the memory I've carried, but you, the actual person. Ethan's throat tightened. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to recede, leaving only her voice, calm and clear. Sophie, don't apologize yet, she interrupted. Not until you remember everything. Not until you understand what you're apologizing for. The challenge in her words silenced him. He studied her face, searching for the girl he'd known. The scholarship student, with dreams bigger than her circumstances. The woman who'd made him laugh until his sides hurt. Who'd seen past his family name to the person beneath. She was there, beneath the polished exterior, but changed. Strengthened by whatever life had dealt her in the years between. We should order, she said finally, opening her menu with a deliberateness that suggested armor being deployed. And then if you're willing, I'd like to talk about what happened. All of it. Ethan nodded, grateful for the momentary reprieve, as he pretended to study the menu. His mind raced through fragmented memories. Sophie's smile in morning light, whispered conversations in the university library. The weight of expectations he'd never questioned until she made him see them. I'm willing, he said finally, closing the menu and meeting her gaze. I owe you that much. A hint of something, relief perhaps, or resolve, softened her expression. Good, she replied. Because I didn't come here for a first date, Ethan. I came for closure. The appetizers arrived, seared scallops for her, foie gras for him, creating a temporary buffer between them. Sophie took a deliberate bite, buying herself time. The Sophie from a decade ago would have rushed to fill uncomfortable silences. This Sophie seemed content to let them stretch. Columbia University, 2013, she finally said, setting down her fork. Introduction to Macroeconomics with Professor Harlow. The memory materialized instantly. A crowded lecture hall. Sophie's hand always the first to rise, her questions sharper than those of students from prestigious prep schools. Ethan had noticed her immediately. Not just for her intelligence, but for the quiet determination that surrounded her like an aura. You sat 3 rows behind me, she continued. Always late, always with coffee. I thought you were just another trust fund kid coasting through. I was, he admitted. Until you called me out during that group project. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You hadn't done the reading. And you didn't let me fake my way through it. The memory warmed him unexpectedly. You said, your family name might impress Professor Harlow, but it doesn't impress me. She shook her head slightly. I was terrified saying that to you. The Coles were practically royalty. You never seemed intimidated. That was the point. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the decade between them compressed. They had been so young. He with his unexamined privilege, she with her fierce ambition. Different worlds that had collided one rainy afternoon in the university library. We started studying together after that, Ethan said, the memories flowing more freely now. You were helping me actually understand economics, not just memorize enough to pass. And you were helping me navigate the social politics I couldn't afford to ignore. Sophie's voice softened. The first time you invited me to that rooftop party at your apartment, I wore the only nice dress I owned. I'd bought it secondhand for interviews. Ethan remembered that dress, deep green, bringing out the color of her eyes. He'd found her on the balcony, away from the crowd, looking out at the city lights with undisguised wonder. You told me you'd never been in a Manhattan penthouse before, he said, that your dad fixed luxury cars, but had never sat in one as a passenger. Sophie nodded. He worked 16-hour days to help pay for what my scholarship didn't cover. When I called to tell him I'd gotten into Columbia, he cried. Only time I ever heard him cry. The waiter cleared their plates, replacing them with their entrees. The interruption felt jarring, pulling them from the past back to the present. When did it change? Sophie asked after the waiter departed. Between us. When did we become more than study partners? Ethan considered the question. The night of the blackout, maybe. December, during finals week. The library evacuation. Her expression softened at the memory. We ended up at that 24-hour diner because my dorm was across campus and your place was too far to walk. We talked until morning, Ethan said, the scene vivid in his mind. Sophie across from him in a vinyl booth, streetlights gradually returning, as they debated everything from economic theory to favorite childhood books. That was when I realized I'd never met anyone like you. We kissed for the first time walking back to campus, she added quietly. It had started snowing. The simplicity of the memory struck him. How pure it had been. How uncomplicated by the realities they'd later face. For those first few months, they'd existed in a bubble of their own making. Study sessions that turned into deep conversations. Quiet dinners in out-of-the-way restaurants where Ethan wouldn't run into family connections. Weekends exploring parts of the city he'd never bothered to visit. We kept it secret, Sophie said, her voice taking on a new edge. Your idea. I told myself it was to protect you, Ethan admitted. From the scrutiny, the judgment. The Cole family was always in the society pages. And a scholarship student from Queens wouldn't exactly fit the expected profile. There was no bitterness in her observation, just a statement of fact. I understood, or thought I did. We were young, still figuring things out. It became real so quickly, Ethan said, remembering the intensity that had caught them both by surprise. By spring I was in love, she finished for him. We both were. The word hung between them, weighted with everything that followed. They ate in silence for a moment, the exquisite food barely registering. That summer changed everything, Sophie finally said. You invited me to the Hamptons house while your family was in Europe. 2 weeks of freedom. No pretense, no hiding. They'd cooked meals together, walked on the beach at midnight, made love with the windows, open to the sound of distant waves. It had been the happiest Ethan could remember being. I told you I wanted a future with you, she continued, that I didn't care about hiding anymore. Once we graduated, Ethan's chest tightened. And then my father announced he was grooming me to take over the company's European division. A test, Sophie said, to see if you were ready for real responsibility. I didn't handle it well. The understatement felt hollow in his mouth. No, she agreed. You didn't. The pressure had been immense. His father's expectations, the family legacy, the path that had been laid out for him since birth. Sophie had represented a deviation, a complication in the narrative of his life. I started pulling away, Ethan acknowledged, the shame of it still fresh, making excuses, canceling plans. And I kept making allowances, Sophie added, telling myself it was temporary stress, that things would go back to normal. Until that final night. April senior year, a week before graduation. Sophie had appeared at his apartment unannounced, soaked from an unexpected downpour, demanding answers he wasn't prepared to give. I told you I'd received a job offer in Chicago, she said. A chance to work with an economic development nonprofit. I asked you what it meant for us, and I said I needed to focus on my family obligations. The words sounded as cowardly now as they had been then. That maybe we should take a break. A break, Sophie repeated. Such a convenient euphemism. What you meant was goodbye. Ethan couldn't deny it. He'd chosen the path of least resistance. The future that required no justification to his family or social circle. I wrote you a letter, she said quietly. After I left your apartment that night, poured everything into it. My hurt, my hope that you might choose differently. I slipped it under your door before I left for Chicago. Ethan stared at her, genuinely confused. I never received any letter. Something flashed in Sophie's eyes, surprise, then a deeper realization. You really didn't read it, did you? Sophie, I swear. She held up her hand. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you let me walk away. And for 10 years, I've lived with the question of why the man who said he loved me couldn't fight for what we had. The dessert menus arrived, neither of them having requested them. Ethan waved them away with a polite smile to the waiter. then ordered coffee for them both. The restaurant had emptied considerably, the late-night crowd thinning to a few lingering couples and business associates. "Why did you agree to this?" Ethan asked when they were alone again. "You knew it was me. You could have declined." Sophie traced the rim of her water glass, considering her answer. Closure partly, but also curiosity. She looked up at him. "I wanted to see if the man sitting across from me tonight resembled the one I created in my mind all these years. And what's the verdict?" Still determining, she studied him with clinical detachment. "What happened after graduation, Ethan? The highlight reel version." He gave her the facts without embellishment. The 2 years in London, learning the European markets. His father's unexpected heart attack that accelerated his return to New York, and his assumption of greater responsibility within coal enterprises. The expansion into sustainable technology that had been his initiative. Doubling the company's value in 3 years. The philanthropic foundation he'd established. Focusing on educational access. Impressive resume, she acknowledged. And personally, Ethan hesitated. A few relationships, nothing lasting. Why not? The directness of her question caught him off guard. The Sophie he remembered had been more circumspect, less willing to push into uncomfortable territory. "They weren't right," he said finally. "They weren't me," she corrected him quietly. "That's what you're not saying." The coffee arrived, providing a momentary reprieve from her piercing assessment. Ethan added a precise amount of cream to his cup, a habit unchanged from their college days. "What about you?" he asked, redirecting the conversation. "Chicago was just the beginning, I assume." Sophie nodded. 3 years with the nonprofit, then graduate school at Northwestern, economic development, with a focus on underserved communities. I consulted for several organizations before moving back to New York 2 years ago. She paused. "I run a program now that helps first-generation college students navigate the financial aspects of higher education. We provide mentoring, financial literacy, networking opportunities." "That sounds exactly like what you always wanted to do," Ethan said, genuine admiration in his voice. "It is." A small, satisfied smile touched her lips. "I'm good at it." "I understand both sides of the equation, the institutions and the students trying to find their way through them. And personally," he echoed her earlier question, "a serious relationship that ended last year." Her honesty was matter-of-fact. "He wanted marriage, children. I wasn't ready. Because of your work. Because I wasn't in love with him." She met his gaze directly. "Not the way I needed to be." The implication hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Their coffee cooled as silence stretched, comfortable in its shared understanding. "I looked for your letter," Ethan finally said, "after you mentioned it. I never received it, Sophie." "I would have remembered." She seemed to weigh his words, testing them for truth. "My roommate said she saw you at a graduation party that weekend, with Vanessa Harding." The name triggered an immediate memory. Vanessa, the daughter of his father's business partner, who'd made her interest in him clear throughout senior year. The party had been a desperate attempt to drown out thoughts of Sophie, to convince himself he was making the right choice. "It didn't mean anything," he said. "I was trying to move on," she finished for him. "Before you'd even ended things properly with me." Ethan couldn't deny it. The shame he'd buried for years surfaced, undiluted by time. "I was a coward," he admitted. "Terrified of disappointing my father, of stepping off the path that had been laid out for me. You represented a choice I wasn't brave enough to make." "And now," Sophie asked, "a decade later, with all your success and achievement, was it worth it?" The question cut to the heart of everything. Ethan looked around the restaurant, at the trappings of the life he'd built, the respect of his peers, the financial security, the family legacy preserved and enhanced. "No," he said simply, "it wasn't." Something shifted in Sophie's expression. Surprise, perhaps, at his candor. "I've achieved everything I was supposed to want," he continued. "But the moments I've felt genuinely alive have been few and far between. Nothing has ever matched the feeling of sitting across from you in that diner during the blackout, or watching you fall asleep on my couch. With an economics textbook on your chest." His honesty seemed to disarm her. For the first time that evening, Her carefully maintained composure wavered. "I'm not telling you this to win you back," he clarified, "or to make excuses. You deserve the truth, even if it's a decade too late." Sophie nodded slowly. "Thank you for that." The check arrived, and Ethan reached for it automatically. "Split it," Sophie said firmly. "I'm not 21 anymore, Ethan. I pay my own way." He didn't argue, recognizing the importance of the gesture. As the waiter processed their cards, rain began to patter against the restaurant's windows. A gentle reminder of that final night, 10 years ago. "It's raining," Sophie observed, a hint of irony in her voice. "Some things don't change," Ethan replied. They stood under the restaurant's awning, watching sheets of rain transform Madison Avenue into a river of reflected lights. The doorman had already called for Ethan's car, but it would be several minutes before it arrived. "I can drop you home," Ethan offered, maintaining a careful distance between them. Sophie shook her head. "I'll get a cab. I need some time to process all this." The night air was cool against their skin, a welcome contrast to the intensity of their conversation inside. Around them, late-night Manhattan continued its relentless pace, taxis splashing through puddles. Couples huddled under shared umbrellas, restaurant workers ending their shifts. "We're getting soaked just standing here," Ethan observed as the awning's protection proved inadequate against the wind-driven rain. On impulse, he stepped out of the downpour, letting it wash over him completely. Sophie stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Something I should have done 10 years ago." He held out his hand to her. "Walk with me, just to the corner." She hesitated, glancing down at her dress, her shoes, practical considerations that the old Ethan would never have thought about. Then, with a small shake of her head that might have been resignation or amusement, she joined him in the rain. They walked side by side, not touching, as water plastered their clothes to their bodies and flattened their carefully styled hair. Neither spoke until they reached the corner, where they turned to face each other under the glow of a streetlight. "The night you came to my apartment," Ethan said, rain streaming down his face. "It was raining like this, I remember," Sophie replied, making no move to wipe the water from her eyes. "I was drenched by the time I reached your door. You looked at me like I was a problem you needed to solve. I was scared," he admitted. "Not of you, but of what you represented. A future I hadn't planned for, emotions I couldn't control. And now..." The question was simple but loaded with meaning. "Now I understand what I threw away." Ethan took a deep breath. "I don't expect forgiveness, Sophie. I don't even expect you to believe me. But meeting you again tonight, it's like being given a glimpse of the road not taken." A taxi approached, its yellow light illuminated. Sophie raised her hand to hail it, then hesitated. "I didn't come tonight expecting anything," she said. "Not reconciliation, not even an apology. I just needed to see you as you are now. Not as the person who's lived in my head all these years." "And what do you see?" She studied him, rain dripping from her eyelashes. Someone who's achieved everything he thought he wanted, and realized too late it wasn't what he needed. The taxi pulled to the curb beside them. "That's a hard lesson, Ethan. One I'm familiar with." He nodded, accepting her assessment. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for how things ended, but for not being brave enough to choose you." Sophie opened the taxi door, but paused before getting in. "What would you do differently, if you could go back?" "Everything," he said without hesitation. "But I can't go back. None of us can." He took a step closer, careful not to crowd her. "I don't want a second chance with the past, Sophie. I want to earn one in your present." Something flickered in her eyes, caution warring with a deeper emotion. "I've spent 10 years building a life without you." "I know, and it sounds like a life to be proud of." "It is." She looked down at her rain-soaked shoes, then back up at him. "This isn't a romantic movie, Ethan. We can't just pick up where we left off and pretend a decade didn't happen." "I'm not asking for that," he said. "I'm asking for coffee. A conversation without the weight of our history crushing it. A chance to know the woman you've become." The taxi driver honked lightly, impatient. Sophie glanced at the waiting car, then back at Ethan. "One coffee," she said finally, as two adults who once meant something to each other. Nothing more. Relief washed over him. "That's all I'm asking for." She nodded, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I'll text you." I still have your number. It's listed on the Cole Foundation website. Of course you did your research, she said, returning her smile. Some things don't change. Some do, she countered, sliding into the taxi. Before closing the door, she added, For what it's worth, Ethan, I'm glad I came tonight, even with the rain. As the taxi pulled away, Ethan remained on the corner, letting the downpour soak him completely. For the first time in years, he felt something break loose inside him. A knot of regret and resignation he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. His driver finally located him, pulling up with a concerned expression. Sir, you're soaked through. Is everything all right? Ethan slid into the back seat, water pooling beneath him on the leather. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. For the first time in a long time, I think it might be. As the car navigated the rain-slick streets toward his Tribeca apartment, Ethan watched the city lights blur through the wet windows. One coffee. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't even a promise, but it was a beginning, or perhaps more accurately, a chance to begin again. This time with the wisdom that only comes from understanding what you've lost. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became occasional dinners. Over the following weeks, Ethan and Sophie carefully reconstructed a relationship that was neither their past nor anything they could have predicted. Their first meeting after the rain-soaked night was at a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, neutral territory, far from the luxury establishments Ethan typically frequented, and equally removed from Sophie's professional world. She arrived in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup disguising the light freckles across her nose that he'd once memorized. Ground rules, she said after they'd ordered, her tone gentle but firm. No grand gestures, no expensive gifts. No trying to impress me with the Ethan Cole that appears in Forbes. He nodded, accepting her terms. What about the Ethan who once ate an entire pizza on a dare, and then had to run 3 miles to make it to your dorm for study group? A smile touched her lips. I might be interested in getting to know again. They started slowly, sharing the broad strokes of their lives since university. Sophie told him about her work with first-generation college students, the challenges and rewards of helping young people navigate systems designed to exclude them. Ethan spoke of his growing disillusionment with the corporate world, his quiet efforts to redirect Cole Enterprises toward more sustainable practices. My father would have hated the direction I'm taking the company, he admitted during their third meeting, a walk through Central Park, on a crisp autumn afternoon. He believed profit was the only meaningful measure of success. And you? Sophie asked, kicking through a pile of fallen leaves. Ethan considered the question. I'm starting to think legacy isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you leave behind that makes the world better than you found it. She studied him with newfound interest. That doesn't sound like the Ethan Cole who was determined to make his first million before 30. He grew up, eventually. Ethan smiled ruefully, though some might argue too late. As October turned to November, their conversations deepened. They discovered shared perspectives that had evolved separately, but along parallel paths. Both had come to value authenticity over appearance, purpose over prestige. Both had learned, through different journeys, the cost of choices made from fear rather than conviction. I almost married him, Sophie confessed one evening, speaking of her previous relationship as they shared a bottle of wine in a quiet restaurant in the village. James. He was kind, stable, everything that made sense on paper. Why didn't you? Ethan asked, trying to ignore the unexpected relief her answer might bring. She traced the rim of her glass. A habit he'd noticed emerged when she was organizing her thoughts. He loved me more than I loved him. And after watching my mother settle for a marriage that slowly hollowed her out, I promised myself I never would. That's brave, Ethan said. Choosing uncertainty over comfortable compromise, or foolish. Her smile held a hint of self-deprecation. Depending on who you ask. I'm asking you. Sophie met his gaze directly. Some days I wonder. But most days I know I made the right choice, for both of us. The tentative trust building between them faced its first real test in early December. Ethan had invited Sophie to a small gallery opening featuring artists from underserved communities, an event that aligned with her interests. while remaining comfortably low-key. But as they moved through the crowded space, a photographer recognized Ethan, snapping several pictures before they realized what was happening. The following morning, their image appeared in the society pages of several online publications. Cole Enterprises CEO with mystery woman at charity event. The articles speculated about Sophie's identity, one even suggesting she might be a potential business partner in Cole's newest venture. Ethan called her immediately, apology ready on his lips. "Sophie, I'm so sorry. I had no idea there would be press." Her silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that he feared the worst. "Sophie, I'm here," she finally said. "Just processing. This is familiar territory." The echo of their past hung between them, the secrecy, the careful avoidance of public scrutiny. Ethan felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "It's different now," he said, the words rushing out. "I'm not hiding you. I'm not ashamed or afraid of what people might think. If anything, I'd shout from rooftops that you're in my life again. But I know that would overwhelm you in it." "Ethan," she interrupted, her voice softer than he expected. "I believe you." The simple statement stopped him short. "You do." 10 years ago, you would have distanced yourself immediately, created some explanation that kept your worlds separate. He heard her take a deep breath. "The fact that your first concern is for my feelings, not your image, that tells me something has changed." Relief washed through him. "Everything has changed, Sophie." "Not everything," she countered. "But enough that I'm not running away at the first sign of complication." The incident marked a turning point. Sophie began to lower the careful guard she'd maintained, allowing herself to acknowledge what had been growing between them. Not nostalgia for what was, but appreciation for what could be. In mid-December, she invited him to observe one of her program's workshops, where college-bound students from low-income backgrounds practiced networking skills with volunteer professionals. Ethan watched as Sophie moved through the room, her natural empathy creating safe space for nervous teenagers to find their voices. "You're extraordinary with them," he told her afterward as they walked through the light snow falling outside the community center. "They remind me of myself," she replied, talented, determined, but missing the unwritten rule book everyone else seems to have memorized. Ethan nodded, understanding. "I'd like to help, if you'd let me, not just with funding, though that's available if you need it, but as a mentor. Someone who can translate the corporate world they're trying to enter." Sophie stopped walking, turning to face him fully. The snowflakes caught in her dark hair, creating a constellation that reminded him of nights they'd spent stargazing on the roof of his college apartment. "You really have changed," she said, wonder in her voice. "Because of you," he replied, "both then and now." She shook her head slightly. "No, Ethan, this was always in you. You just needed to find it for yourself." Standing there in the gently falling snow, Ethan recognized the truth in her words. The man he'd become wasn't shaped solely by regret or the desire to recapture what he'd lost. He'd grown into someone who finally understood what mattered, someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. Spring arrived in New York, with its characteristic unpredictability. Warm sunshine, giving way to sudden showers, cherry blossoms, appearing overnight, only to be scattered by capricious winds. In the 4 months since their rain-soaked reunion, Ethan and Sophie had established a new rhythm, one that honored their shared history without being defined by it. On a mild April evening, almost exactly 10 years after their original parting, Ethan invited Sophie to dinner at his apartment. Not the sleek penthouse his position might have suggested, but a converted loft in Tribeca with exposed brick walls and tall windows that filled the space with natural light. It was the first time she'd seen where he lived, a threshold they'd both recognized needed the right moment to cross. "You cook now," Sophie observed with amused surprise as she watched him move confidently around the kitchen, preparing a meal that required more skill than the microwave pizza they'd subsisted on in college. "One of many skills acquired in your absence," he replied, handing her a glass of wine. "Turns out when you live alone and work 80-hour weeks, you either learn to cook or develop a first-name relationship with every delivery person in the neighborhood. And you chose cooking." She leaned against the counter, studying him with open appreciation. I'm impressed. Don't be too impressed until you've tasted it, he warned, though the ease with which he handled the multiple dishes suggested his modesty was unnecessary. As they ate at the simple wooden table overlooking the city, Ethan seemed distracted, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, despite his efforts at conversation. Is everything all right? Sophie finally asked. You seem preoccupied. Ethan set down his fork, meeting her gaze directly. I've made a decision. A significant one. I wanted you to be the first to know. Sophie's expression shifted to concern. What is it? I'm stepping down as CEO of Coal Enterprises. The statement hung between them, momentous in its simplicity. Sophie's eyes widened. Ethan, that's why. The company is thriving under your leadership. It is, he agreed. And my COO, Diane Chen, is more than capable of taking over. She shares my vision for where the company should go, but brings perspectives I could never have. But this has been your life's work, Sophie said carefully. Everything you've built was built on a foundation I never questioned, he interrupted gently. Until you. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could bridge the distance if she chose. I'm not abandoning ship. I'll remain on the board, provide guidance where needed, but I'm creating something new, a foundation focused specifically on economic mobility through education. Understanding dawned in Sophie's eyes, like my program but larger scale. Ethan nodded. The Sophie Lane Foundation, if you'll permit me to use your name, dedicated to providing first-generation college students, not just scholarships, but the social capital they need to succeed. Mentorship, internships, networking, opportunities. Ethan. Sophie's voice held a mixture of emotions too complex to name. I'm not doing this for you, he clarified quickly, or not only for you. I'm doing it because meeting you, both 10 years ago and now, showed me what truly matters, what kind of legacy I want to leave. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what he was sharing. Then, deliberately, she placed her hand over his. I'm honored, and I think it's brilliant. Relief washed over his features. There's more. I'd like you to help shape it as an advisor, a partner in creating something that could change thousands of lives. Your expertise, your lived experience, they're invaluable. A partnership, she said thoughtfully, testing the word. In every sense, if you're willing. Ethan turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. Sophie, these past months have been a gift I never expected, and certainly never deserved. Getting to know you again, the woman you've become, has been the greatest privilege. Sophie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. When I agreed to that blind date, I thought the best outcome would be closure. I never imagined. Neither did I, he admitted. But here we are. Here we are, she echoed softly. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle at first, then with increasing intensity, a mirror of that night 10 years before. But this time, instead of separation, the rain seemed to cocoon them, creating an intimate world of their own making. I love you, Ethan said simply, not the memory of you, or some idealized version I've carried all these years. I love who you are now, your strength, your compassion, your unwillingness to settle for less than you deserve. Sophie's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with a joy he'd waited a decade to see again. I love you too. The man you've become, the one who finally understands that true wealth has nothing to do with money. They moved to the window, watching the city transform beneath the rain. Ethan stood behind Sophie, his arms encircling her waist, her head resting back against his shoulder, a position that felt both new and achingly familiar. 10 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life letting you walk away, he murmured against her hair. I won't make that mistake again. Good, Sophie replied, turning in his arms to face him. Because I'm not going anywhere. Their kiss held the promise of a future neither could have imagined when they sat across from each other in that restaurant months before, a future built not on the ashes of what was lost, but on the solid foundation of who they had become. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of regret and uncertainty. Inside, in the warm light of the apartment, Ethan and Sophie began again, wiser, stronger, and finally ready for the love they had once been too young to fully understand.